Hey, it's Art from my new microphone. In this video, let's discuss a key concept to understand for creating dimensionality in your mixes. The key concept that we will be discussing in this video is 3D or three-dimensional mixing, notably with the dimensions of height, width, and depth. When mixing, it's often a great strategy to think about how we naturally hear sound in the real world and try to emulate this to the best of our abilities within the mix. By using faders, panning, effects, processes, and contrast within the mix, we can create a great sense of depth, width, and height. So without further ado, let's discuss these three dimensions. Starting with height, which is perhaps the least intuitive dimension to understand when it comes to mixing. Height refers to the frequency content of a mix, going all the way from the low end at 20 Hertz all the way to the high end at 20,000 Hertz. The best way to understand height is actually in the language. We have the low end frequencies, which make up the bass and sub-bass. We have the high end frequencies that make up the air and brilliance, and all of the mid-range in between. Additionally, we have high pass filters, which will effectively pass the high frequencies while eliminating the lows, or low pass filters that pass the lows while eliminating the highs, high shelf and low shelf filters, and so on. As I just mentioned, the universally accepted human range of hearing spans from 20 Hertz to 20,000 Hertz, and it's often best to fill out this range and get a great sense of height within the mix rather than focusing our efforts on any particular frequency bands within the mix. So getting a great sense of height by filling up this frequency range is perhaps a little bit easier to do in denser mixes. Say we have a kick drum holding down the low end along with a bass guitar, cymbals holding up the high end, and vocals and guitar and bass holding down the lows, mids, and highs together. It's important to focus on these elements and mix them in a way that fills out the frequency spectrum to obtain a great height in a mix. In sparser mixes, say for a singer-songwriter where there's only an acoustic guitar and a vocal, we should still do our best to kind of fill out as much of this frequency content as we can in order to get a great sense of height in the mix. Height in this way is perhaps more so a concern for arrangement than it is for mixing. However, when it does come time to mix, we should be paying attention to the overall height of a mix and use EQ and other processes to help fill out this height dimension. Moving on to depth now. Depth refers to the perceived distance between the listener and the various sound sources or tracks within the mix. In the real world, we can intuitively gather a sense of different sound sources and how far they are from us, depending on the transient information, the levels, and the overall frequency content of the source. When mixing, we can emulate and create a sense of depth in the mix in the following ways. First, we can use faders in the mix to emulate depth. All else being equal, a track that is pushed hotter or louder in the mix will be perceived as being closer to the listener, and tracks that are mixed quieter will be perceived as being further. Second, we can use high shelf boosts and cuts to bring things closer or further from the listener in the mix. The higher frequencies of sound waves are naturally absorbed by the air faster than the lower frequencies, and so in the real world, if a source is further away from us, we will hear less of its high frequency content than if it was up close. So again, we can emulate this with high shelf boosts to bring things closer, or high shelf cuts to move things further away in the mix. The third strategy for emulating depth in a mix is to actually use transient shaping. By enhancing the transient information of a track, we can actually pull that track a little bit closer to the listener. In many cases, the closer we are to a sound source in real life, the more we will perceive its full dynamic range. And as we move further away from sound sources in the real world, we will hear less of its dynamic range. By enhancing the transients of a track then, we can increase the dynamic range and have the effect of pulling it a bit closer to the listener. We can also use a transient shaper to dull the transients of a track and to help push it a little bit further back in the mix. And speaking of dulling the transients, this brings us to technique number 4, and that is to use compression to push things a little bit further back in the mix. Again, with compression, we are acting to decrease the dynamic range of the signal, which can give it the effect of being a bit more subdued and pushed further back in the mix. An interesting note I have here on compression and perceived depth is that by using compression to maintain a very consistent level in a track, we can actually anchor that track in wherever it is perceived in the depth field. For example, if we have a vocal that is way up front in the mix, we can use compression to maintain a very consistent level and to keep that vocal up front in the mix throughout the entirety of the song. So compression can and is used to push things further back in the mix, but we should also be aware of its ability to really keep things up front and center as well. And the fifth tip when it comes to perceived depth in a mix is of course to use delay and reverb to position a track or bus within the depth field in a mix. Short slapback delays can give the effect of bringing a track closer to the listener as it emulates a very small space. Medium delay times and reverb effects can really solidify a track's position along the dimension of depth. And then of course, washing out a track with longer delay times or large reverbs can really push it far back in the mix. So once again, when it comes to depth in the mix, mess around with faders, high shelf boosts and cuts, transient shaping, compression, and delay and reverb to really hone in on the sense of depth in the mix. If you're finding this concept of 3D mixing valuable thus far, I would invite you to hit that like button and to also subscribe to the Mining Microphone YouTube channel for more information here on music and audio. Thank you. Moving on now to our third dimension, and that is width. Perhaps the most intuitive dimension when it comes to stereo mixes, as we have a left channel and a right channel. Width in a stereo mix is largely due to the differences between the left and the right channel, which pretty much coincide with the differences that we hear in our left and right ears. In the real world, we actually hear in perfect surround sound due to the shape of our ears and our perception. However, in mixing a stereo mix with a left and right channel is typically enough to give us that sense of three-dimensional space. Width in a mix can be emulated in many different ways, which we will get to shortly. But first, I just really want to stress the point that contrast is key when it comes to width and really any of the dimensions that we've discussed so far. For example, if we had all of our tracks panned to the hard left and hard right and nothing in the center image, we wouldn't have a very wide mix or a mix that sounds very good. Likewise with depth, if we only had tracks that were either completely dry and very upfront close to the listener and tracks that were completely washed out with reverb and pushed way far back, we wouldn't really have a strong sense of depth in the mix. And the same thing goes for height. For example, if we had only a sub bass in the low end and a triangle up in the high end, it may make for a funny song, but it wouldn't give us a great sense of height in the mix. So contrast is key when it comes to dimensionality of height, depth, and width. Now let's move on to talk about how width can be emulated within a mix. The primary tools for creating width in a mix are, of course, the pan pots. With the pan pots, we can pan tracks hard left, hard right, or anywhere in between. By panning different tracks across the stereo spectrum and achieving a nice balance between the left and right channels, we can achieve a very wide mix only using panning. The second technique for increasing width in a mix, of course, is reverb, which has the effect of really filling out a space across the stereo spectrum. Thirdly, we have stereo delays, especially if they are set to different times between the left and right channel. This can really give a great sense of depth in the mix by, again, having those differences between the left and right channels. And the fourth technique is to utilize mid-side processing, where we can focus our efforts on processing only the mids versus only the sides information. And by increasing the sides information, we can effectively increase the width of a mix, and then by bringing them back down, we can decrease and narrow the mix as well. So I hope that this concept of 3D mixing proves valuable to you and your future mixes. I encourage and challenge you to think about height, width, and depth when it comes to mixing your own music, but also when listening to other people's music, especially when listening on headphones. If you're interested in learning more about mixing, I have a free resource for you called the Mining Microphone Mixing Cheat Sheet. I have a link to that in the description box down below. Of course, there are no cheat codes when it comes to mixing, as every mix is different and requires different processing, but this so-called cheat sheet I put together acts as a great reference guide to help you make the right mixing decisions at the right times. So if you're interested in that, again, there's a link in the description box down below. So check that out, and I'll also put another few videos here on the Mining Microphone YouTube channel worth checking out as well. So click on one of these, and I'll see you in the next video.